Well, hello there, everybody. Welcome to WriterLens. How is everybody out there? Today, we are going to be discussing the film The Queen. So, quite a departure from Star Wars last week. This
Right,
film
anybody
is,
else?
of course.
Stately conference room, different.
Sorry about that. I'm gonna be talking over myself. All right, so yes, quite a departure from Star Wars last week. This is a historical piece. I label it as historical fiction, but obviously it is based on actual events. But of course, it is Peter Morgan's interpretation of them. He puts it into a narrative, and he makes it a very compelling story. In fact, the success of this work is why you have him eventually being tasked to do The Crown on Netflix, which of course has been a huge success. So, something to look at. Now, when it comes to us novel writers, we might be wondering, well, what can we learn, in fact, from a film like The Queen? After all, it's a lot of talking, it's kind of a pot boiler. What can we learn out of it? Well, I'm here to tell you 3 tips for writing historical fiction that we can get from the Queen. So, number 1, don't forget your protagonist motivation. The Queen is, of course, about the Queen. The Queen is the protagonist of the film. And what Peter Morgan does so effectively is he sets up from the beginning a clear motivating factor for the Queen. This really is a survival story about her keeping her power, her reputation, her effect on society. When you think of a character, a motivation, a protagonist, it usually falls into these 3 categories. I would put this in that wealth category because I put that in with power. It's your placement, your status in society, and that often is the biggest motivating factor of a character. Um, and the thing about the Queen is, like I said, it sets that up so well. And this is something that a lot of people will neglect to do when it comes to historical fiction or just fiction in general. Especially though with historical fiction, because they know that there is such a compelling event, right? You're writing about an interesting time in history, maybe even a specific event in history. And you can forget that the viewpoint character, the character that we're following, needs to have that trackable goal, something that we can follow along the way. And this is something I always like to talk about. I like to talk about the fact that the most intimidating or scary image in our life is this little progress bar, right? Because we're on the edge of our seat waiting for that file to download. And that's the same way you want your audience to be for your protagonist. So when your protagonist has a concrete goal that it's clear for the audience, and this movie, it's quite clear. The Queen wants to keep that power, wants to keep her reputation. And so as the movie keeps bringing up, your reputation is slipping, your popularity is going down, the pivotal moment, what I call the pit of this movie, is when she finds out that 1 in 4 Britons want to get rid of the monarchy altogether. That is when her back is to the wall. And it's an interesting place to put a character, right? So Peter really has to set up this high stakes situation for the Queen in order for that to be a pow moment. Because it really is almost like life or death, because so much of her life is wrapped around this position. All right, tip number 2. What the Queen does so well is it showcases multiple reactions. After all, when you talk about history, you're going to bring your perspective. History is about doing research, and often it can feel a little bit like a rant. It can feel like you're making some sort of commentary because you have this point of view that, this war was bad, or this war was justified, or this political position was bad, or so on and so forth. But political rants are not great stories most of the time. You'll notice that effective politicians, even people that are trying to give a political speech, what do? They put it in a narrative. Yeah, you got that. They will tell a story. They'll often, give an anecdote. They'll be like, "Oh, I was talking to Joe Blow Schmo on the street," and things like that, because we resonate with that more than just this abstract concept. And another way that the queen gives a sense of sophistication is it gives a lot of perspectives on the situation the queen is facing. It's all too easy to look back at history and be like, well, these were the good guys, these were the bad guys, this was the right side of history, this was the wrong side of history. And even if you have a clear point of view, nothing wrong with that. You don't want it to be so muddy the audience doesn't know what to make of it. But even if you have a clear point of view, make sure you represent an opposing viewpoint. This work does a great job. It has all of those characters that I talk about, the core characters, the thematic characters. It gives you a perspective from all different angles. And finally, uh, you need to determine what facts are concrete in the history you're talking about. After all, everybody comes to a historical event with a bias, with a sense of what happened. And memory is a little bit tricky. We all know that for us, perception is reality. Think of what they call the Mandela effect, right? Where people have a strong sense of something that happened, and it's not what happened. On the other hand, there is a certain amount of information the audience will bring with them that they know. And those things, when you mess with, it's not going to go over too well. But don't forget that memory is a fickle thing. So you have to kind of weigh what it is that people actually know, which is true, and then maybe what even people know that's not true, and figure out how to juggle that. Because if you mess with something that people generally think is true and it's not, well, you'll get those people being like, what are you doing? That's not the way the history goes. And so you'll really have to justify it. And you may find out it's not even worth it. After all, what you're writing is historical fiction. This is not trying to tell the story exactly as it took place. Even in the context of a movie like The Queen, which does spend a lot of effort to be accurate in a fair amount of the ways that it is, it's still presenting it in a narrative. It's distilling it, it's squeezing it into that form. So, those are three tips that we can get from the Queen to help with our writing. But I'm going to go and take a little bit of a deeper dive here and talk about what, and that was kind of introduction, and we're going to go a little bit deeper. So, I love my little chart here, the hook, question, decision, fun and games, the pit, climbing out new world. Yes, even in a story like this, a political drama, Peter Morgan manages to put it in this formula, which is one reason why it's so successful. So we have the hook. We begin with the queen, and she's there getting her painting, she's getting a portrait painted, and she's interacting with the artist, and you have this sense, she's a little bit trapped. She wishes she could be more like a regular civilian, but yet she's definitely somebody who uh, respects the place in society that she is at and does not really want that to change. They're having a conversation about, modernizers and skepticism about that. So we get to the question, which is, with the impact of the death of Princess Diana, how is the queen going to react? Is she going to react in a modern way, or is she going to react in a traditional way? And that gives her to the decision where she decides to act the way that she thinks is best. Keep it private, keep it personal, and that ends up causing a lot of issues, which is more or less the fun in games. It's almost more like a horror story in this case, because every decision she makes just makes the perception of her get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until finally we end up with the pit, like I said earlier, where 1 in 4 of her citizens want to throw her out. They don't want her to be a monarch anymore. So it's essentially like 1 in 4 want to kill you because that is her identity, right? So, and the movie makes a great work at that, making it clear to the audience that that is her identity. So when you get to that pow moment that she has to change what she does in order to alleviate this, growing tempest of people that want to get rid of her, you really feel that. You really feel that dark night of the soul, as it often is called. And then she has the climbing out where she gives her speech. She shows the emotion that she's capable of doing. She puts on what she calls the grand performance, and it alleviates the mobs that think she's not reacting correctly. And she ends up in a new world where she has to kind of reconfigure the tradition versus the modernizing, and she's grown from the experience. She kind of sees a different sort of place for herself. Now, I was talking about those characters earlier, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. So, of course, the protagonist is Queen Elizabeth. The relationship character is Tony Blair. He's ultimately the character that is going to serve as the bridge between her and the antagonist, which is represented by his wife. She is the character throughout the piece that constantly is pushing against the monarchy. These people make all this money. Why do we even need them? Let's move on with the times. Obviously, it goes beyond that. The 1 in 4 eventually come to her side, but she is that personification, which is necessary. You can't just have a faceless mass. You need somebody that represents that viewpoint. And then, of course, you have the distraction character, who is Prince Philip, who is trying to convince the queen to go with her traditional ways. Don't listen to these modernizing people. We don't need to listen to them. Stick to your guns. You have the support character, the psychic character, the queen mum, who more or less is just supportive. She more or less just wants to do what is right by the queen. You have Prince Charles, who is the emotional character. He's often reacting in an emotional way. A reason is the queen's assistant or butler. And then the opposition is Tony Blair's assistant, Alistair, who is just like, yeah, she's not going to be able to pull this off. And we'll get to the details about that, and I can prove it in the text. Let's get to this text. Let's get to this sharp dialogue. Like I said, the opening scene where you have Elizabeth and the artist. They're having chit chat, but they're getting this exposition out that Tony Blair is a young prime minister. And the artist says, well, they didn't vote for him. And Elizabeth's like, oh, you're not a modernizer. And the artist says, certainly not. We're in danger of losing too much that's good about this country as it is. And so it's a way to get that exposition out at what's at stake, what's changing in society. And at the very end of the scene, Elizabeth says she envies being able to vote, but because of the sheer joy of being partial. So you really get a sense of this, the idea that she feels a little bit trapped in her position. She's not able to interact in society like anybody else. And also her clear idea of where she is. She's very much above it all, in her own little realm. So then we get to the scene with Queen Elizabeth and Tony Blair. And you'll notice that she very much dominates the conversation. She says, your children must be very proud. You're 3, that's right. And then she's like, so have you shown you how to start a nuclear war yet? She's like a little abrasive and a little bit, out in front of Tony, which of course is going to reverse towards the end because she's going to have to come underneath Tony Blair's advice. So to start her out very strong against him gives her a place to go, kind of knocks her down a peg. Uh, as you see later in this conversation, Tony starts talking, and Queen Elizabeth's like, nope, nope, nope. It's usual for me to ask the questions. She's like cutting him off, and then she's like, so you got to do this, and she's like, generally, this is where you say yes, and he's like, yes, and it's just she's very intimidating, very, I know how to do this, and I'm not so sure you know what you're doing, and I'm just gonna handhold you through. And ultimately, he is the character that must instruct her. So quite a change, quite a change. All right, so then we get to Alistair, and I said this is this opposition character. And you can tell part of the personality of an opposition character is they tend to be a little skeptical, a little cynical. And in this scene, he's already writing down the speech, and Tony's like, she's only been dead half an hour. And he's like, well, you prefer I didn't do my job? Opposition characters are often very fun to write because they're the skeptic, the Han Solo types. And then later you'll see where he really shows his opposition colors, where he's watching the news and he's like, not the press, you've got the wrong villain in terms of who's responsible for Diana's death, because he ultimately lays the blame on the royal family. And he says, you're about to speak to the queen. Tony Blair says yes. And he says, ask her if she greased the brakes. So you can tell just very anti the queen. And later he's like, I don't think she's going to pull this off. Like, this is ridiculous. First of all, when Tony addresses the queen and he gives her that decision, right, I was talking about earlier, he talks about the funeral. How are you going to do a funeral? There's this fever pitch of demand. People are upset. Diana was such a big figure. How are you going to react? And Queen Elizabeth is like, well, it should be a private funeral. It's really a private matter. We should be respected as much, and the Spencer family is who's going to handle it, and all of that. And of course, he doesn't think much of it. And she ends up saying, I shouldn't told her he shouldn't change a thing. And at that point, the Queen Mother is like, you're right, because again, she's that supportive character. She mostly goes along with what Queen Elizabeth wants to do. She ends up being mostly supportive of that. Now later, we get to Charles, and that is where you get to him being the emotional character, right? I was thinking last night what Diana might have done had it been me that died in the tunnel in Paris. She certainly would have taken. I regret doing that now. He's having a lot of emotional human reactions. She was a wonderful mother. She adored those boys and never let them forget it. Always warm. He's expressing those human emotions, and Queen Elizabeth has a much more cynical view, especially whenever a photographer was in sight. But then he keeps going and he says, that was the extraordinary thing about her. Her weaknesses and transgressions only seem to make the public love her more, yet ours only make them hate us. Why is that? Why do they hate us so much? And then she says, not us, dear. Which she's going to find out that actually Prince Charles is rather correct in this situation. Like I said, representing that emotional reaction to the situation. Why do they hate us? Getting into the human emotions. Now you can see how this is done subtly enough, because Peter Morgan is excellent at character work, that it doesn't feel cartoony or too, I don't want to say archetypical. There's nothing wrong with being archetypical, but it doesn't feel like, a bunch of cardboard cutouts. It's just every person in the script has a purpose, has a place. They're representing a worldview, and that is what makes it so effective, because you could make it much more nuanced, and everyone's kind of talking about everything. And that would maybe be more realistic, but for the purpose of fiction, for the purpose of narrative, by distilling these emotional reactions and worldviews into characters, it just really helps bring the audience through that story, paints that picture, and is just so much more effective. Otherwise, it's like, well, you might as well just have an audio recording going in the car, which we all know wouldn't be terribly interesting, or certainly not as clear cut in terms of a narrative. It's like then you would have to do the work of figuring out what all this means, right? When a writer is taking a piece of reality, a piece of history, and framing it in such a way, it's almost like they're trying to be like a scientist or a chemist or something, and breaking down the pieces so that you can understand it. And even though the movie definitely takes a sympathetic look at Queen Elizabeth, and it is, slanted that direction, it definitely gives everybody else reason to disagree, reason to take different approaches, to the point where I could easily see an audience member, thinking that Queen Elizabeth is in the wrong pretty much the whole movie, and still enjoying the piece, because everyone has solid motivations and reasons for what they're doing. Now, later on, you can get in a sense of Prince Philip being that, what I call distraction character, the contagonist. He's the person that if Queen Elizabeth listened to, would ruin the movie. He's offering the wrong advice. He's the dark side, as it were, because he is they're talking about the fact that the flag at Buckingham Palace should be half-mast, and Prince Philip is like, well, I hope Robin told him there isn't a flag above Buckingham Palace, only the royal standard, which flies for one reason, or only to denote the presence of the monarch. Since you're here, the flagpole is bare, which is as it should be. Okay, so that's his, very down the line point. And it's not like it's a bad point. That was the tradition, right? I mean, he has a good reason for thinking that. But then Charles gives the emotional reaction. So Prince Charles says, isn't it possible that to some people the royal standard is just a flag and that the flagpole being bare sends out the wrong signal? Again, he's thinking emotionally of what these things might represent. Um, So then we get into Tony coming back in here, and he's like, under normal circumstances, I agree. And Prince Philip is like, oh, here we go again, the bloody flag again. He's that negative force constantly throughout that's trying to get her back to the traditional side. Meanwhile, Tony Blair, he starts out maybe a little bit hesitant, and then gradually he becomes more intense in terms of his advice of, you got to do something. This is getting out of hand. The public support isn't there. You better fix it. Prince Philip is all talking. He's like, this reminds me of those films. A few of us in a fort, hordes of Zulus outside. So it's vital you hold firm. Stick to your guns. You wait. They will come to their senses soon. They have to. So, he gets more intense too. It really becomes, she's going to have to let somebody down because they're completely opposing each other, which is a way where they're standing in that character sheet, right? The distraction character is the opposite of the relationship character. Whatever character is trying to convince the protagonist to do the opposite of what they need to do, probably the distraction character. So here we have that dark night in the soul, that pit when Tony lays down that hammer. Polls is to be published in tomorrow's papers suggest 70% of people believe your actions have damaged the monarchy, and 1 in 4 are now in favor of abolishing the monarchy altogether. And as I said, the way the movie sets this up is this is the only identity that she knows. This is her entire life. So this is like 1 in 4 people essentially wanting to kill her, in terms of, for all intents and purposes, her personality, what's her existence, they want to destroy. So it's a very dark place to put somebody, but yet physically nothing is at stake. So it just goes to show how you can make some strong motivation, some strong character story beats, and you don't necessarily have to put the person in physical jeopardy. And then Alistair, again, he's that opposition character. I made a couple of changes, so it sounds like it comes from a human being. He doesn't think that she's going to be able to pull this off. He's concerned that, she's just incapable of sounding like a regular person. And, the old boots finally agreed to pay respects at Diana's coffin. He's just so negative, contrarian. She's never going to pull it off. And then Tony does this little bit of a rant, and you can see here where he is that relationship character trying to kind of bridge everything, make sense of the whole situation. The relationship character is often that character that just has that insight, and we all know people like that. They just have such great insight as to what is going on. They're the person you call in the middle of a crisis, and you're like, okay, I know I'm going to hear crazy things on this side of the aisle, on this side of the aisle. What's going on? And that is the way that the relationship character is in fiction. They're the one that can look at that crazy world around the protagonist and have it make sense. So he does this speech. That woman has given her whole life into service to her people, 50 years doing a job she never wanted, a job she watched kill her father. She's executed with dignity, honor, and as far as I can tell, without a single blemish. And now we line up begging for her blood. Why? Because she's struggling to lead the world in mourning for a woman who threw everything she offered back in her face and who seemed in the last few hours to be committed 24/7 to destroy everything she holds dear. And he just spells it out. Now, you could be like, wow, that's really on the nose. That's really like exact. That's really spelling it to the audience. But we like that. There's nothing wrong with a character when you establish they're astute, when you establish that they're are good at observing the world and making these distillations. We love things like that. Think about how many people that, like I said, you look out to for things like that. So it is very refreshing, especially in the darkest hour of the protagonist, to get this clear vision of, oh, that's what's going on. You're right, and it just gives you that motivation to get through the rest of the book. So don't be afraid to have a character essentially spell out what's going on. And in this way too, he's doing it in a very kind of rant sort of way, so it's very energetic. But like I said, it pays off because it is a nice spelling out of what's going on from a character who earned it and who is going to motivate the protagonist to do the right thing. Thinking back to last week, Obi-Wan Kenobi, he really tells you the entire purpose of the universe, or the makings of the universe, and those characters are strong. Don't be afraid to have characters like that. All right, so here we have our reason character coming in here, and he's taking a suggestion, and he ultimately is giving her this question. Elizabeth reads the change, so what I say to you as your queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. And he's like, well, do you think you can say it? A reasonable question. He's thinking just from a practical standpoint, are we even going to be able to pull this off? And she's like, do I have a choice? And that, again, it makes you have sympathy. She's kind of trapped into this situation where she's really having to behave in a way that is against her identity, against what she stands for, just in order to preserve herself. And here you have Tony Blair's wife, Sherry, getting completely bulldozed because this is the defeat of the antagonist in this story. So the Queen Elizabeth is saying, as a grandmother, I say from her heart. And she's like, heart? What heart? She doesn't mean a word of this. And again, we have this relationship character to come in to explain. That's not the point. What she's doing is extraordinary. That's how you survive. So it's not like he is a Pollyanna type, the relationship character is smart. And that's how you can earn rants like that rant we just went through. And Cherie's like, listen to you. A week ago, you were the great modernizer making speeches about the people's princesses, and now you've gone weak at the knees. I don't know why I'm surprised. In the end, all labor ministers go gaga for her match. So, she's been defeated. Essentially, she came in guns a-blazing, wanted to get rid of the monarchy, and he was going to, help it and look at this great opportunity, and we can take advantage of this politically and get rid of this once and for all. And nope. Wah, 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 So, but again, she is that representation of anybody who was truly anti the queen. We find out, that the speech went over well as well. But in this scene, the relationship character who's already established himself as the character that knows how the world works has basically told her, yep, you lost. She survived. And we know that he carries that weight. So at the very end, she's even nagging him, off to see your girlfriend. It's quite a debt of gratitude she owes you, Mr. Savior of the monarchy. So, makes it pretty clear who the relationship character is in here. And at the very end, we see how the conversation has changed between Tony Blair and Queen Elizabeth. 1 in 4, you said, wanted to get rid of me. And then Tony Blair's like, oh, for about a half an hour. And then you came down to London and all that went away. Trying to put perspective in it. It was an extreme reaction, but, you're fine. Queen Elizabeth, I've never been hated like that before. Tony, no, and that must have been difficult. And Elizabeth said, it was very. And then she gives more. But I like how it starts out with just that quick, yeah. Because it's just, it's very powerful when somebody, and she does give a longer speech, but when somebody says something that's like, that must be really awful. And you're like, mm-hmm. It just carries that thump. And Elizabeth said, ever since Diana, people want glamour and tears, the grand performance, and I'm not very good at that. I prefer to keep my feelings to myself. Foolishly, I believe that's what people wanted from their queen, not to make a fuss, nor wear one's heart on one's sleeve, duty first, self second. It's how I was brought up. It's all I've ever known. So you can see here what she had to learn. Again, she spells it out. But it makes sense that she would need to unpack this, even though this might feel very on the nose and direct and something that writers get nervous about, because, she really just needs to process. And Tony Blair has become a little bit of her psychiatrist throughout this whole thing. He's really earned that level of trust. And you can also see how she has opened herself up to him throughout the process, right? And you also will see how I talked about last week with the protagonist defeats the antagonist and then the relationship character comes in. Yeah, you see it here too. The antagonist, Tony Blair's wife, defeated. Tony Blair comes in, and he and Elizabeth have this great conversation, and they more or less end up with this is going to be the beautiful beginning of a beautiful friendship, which is a great way to end a story. When you end up with the protagonist and the relationship character kind of walking away in the sunset, it often works really well. Because again, it shows you the protagonist has embraced a worldview that will make sense to them. It gives you a sense of peace. So you see Elizabeth, but I can see the world has changed and one must modernize. Tony, well, perhaps that's where I can help. Don't get ahead of yourself, Prime Minister. I think you'll find out that I'm supposed to be advising you. So get a little bit of playful banter going on. So what might we expect in your first parliament? And then he just goes on to talk about reducing classroom sizes. It doesn't really matter. You just get the idea of where the relationship is going to go from here. And it is a little bit of a piece of like a nugget for the audience to hold on to because Elizabeth is saying, I can see where I must modernize. And it does make you wonder, well, what is her next step? What other things might she change? So it's enough to let you see that the character hasn't reached the end of their goal and it's just frozen, that the story is going to continue. And that can be a great way of ending your story, giving your audience something to latch onto. So, that was a lot of ranting about the Queen. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this film. I thought it was terrific when I saw it. I love anything that's a good political pot boiler with well-drawn characters, which this certainly is. Nominated for Best Picture, Best Screenplay, so very well regarded. And like I said, the reason why Peter Morgan ended up with The Crown, which is also an excellent television show. Oh, thank you, Aaron. I'm glad you found it fascinating. Now, did any of you have any thoughts that you thought of when viewing this piece, or any of my comments that made you wonder, questions or thoughts from anybody? I might have made you speechless. I certainly hope not. I really like the breakout character types. Yes, I have found that is very beneficial to me as a writer. And I know writers will sometimes kind of flinch when you start talking about things like that because they can kind of feel they get boxed in. But the point of something like that is not so before you write down your first sentence of your first draft that you had to mark out all those 8 characters and really put people in a corner. It's just something that when you're done with a first draft, you could look at and make sure, you can maybe enhance because you'll find, especially since we do a lot of things subconsciously, you probably did throw in a lot of that just by default, but you can enhance it. You can be like, oh, this person really is that emotional character. I'm going to boost it up a bit. Is this another example of the heroine's journey or virgin's promise alternative view of the mythic structure? Interesting. I'd have to think about that one. It helps to understand how a dialogue may sound along with the various interactions. Yeah, it can really help when you do a scene, right? Because when you do a scene and you know it's going to be like an exposition scene, obviously, anytime you can throw that opposing force into an exposition scene, it's going to be much more interesting. So if the protagonist is having to do exposition like, how do we get across the bridge? Or how do we get across this river? Because obviously there's that bridge that would be hard. How do we get across this river? Well, maybe we could make a rope bridge. Well, if you have that opposition character, it's like, well, no, that's not going to work for X, 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 and X reason. And you're not even capable of doing that. And it just makes the scene much more interesting as they're saying. Or that emotion character. I don't know. That sounds really scary. Can we pull that off? The water looks really cold. I don't like water, and just throwing in those other characters and those reactions can help. If you just have the protagonist and a support character, what ends up happening is we could build a rope bridge. Sounds great. Let's get going. And it's kind of a boring scene. So what you'll find is if you go back to your work, go back to your draft, that's kind of a task for you, or when you're writing, when you're doing a scene, if it ever gets a little boring, if it's kind of dry, if it feels like it's not going anywhere, if it doesn't have that dynamite quality you're looking for, look at your character complement. Look and see who's cast in that scene. I always say, you want the character that's in the most pain if you can do it. But beyond that character that's in the most pain, you want the person maybe in the opposite, the character that's the happiest that moment, because then you have conflict. If somebody's really happy about what's going on, somebody's really depressed, and so it's much more interesting to watch. Any other thoughts from anybody about the Queen? All right. Well, next week we are going to be watching Inception. So quite a switch. I like to switch things up genre-wise. We did Star Wars, The Queen, next Inception, and that one. If you want to talk about a work that has to get away with a ton of exposition, yeah, that is a deep, dense work that is filled with explanations and speechifying of, well, this and this and this and technobabbly sort of thing. So it's fun to inspect from that standpoint as to how did Christopher Nolan do it and not bore the audience or just overwhelm them so much that they couldn't accept it. Uh, Recently, Nolan had the work Tenet, which people found a step too far. So Inception, though, really hit that balance well. So let's take a look at that and see how he pulled it off. And if you would like to join us this evening, we're going to be discussing Wizard of Oz versus Treasure Island. Which book is better? So if you are somebody that's a fan of either work, you can join that conversation. And don't forget, on Sundays at 8 p.m., we also have The Story Doctor, where I will be talking about story problems such as world building disease, perhaps. Or maybe you have other ailments like, I don't know, tell-itis, where you show your characters and feelings, or where you don't show your characters and feelings, you tell us about them. Or perhaps you have a sagging plot line. Yeah, maybe your second act in your 3-act structure is a little boring because you don't quite know what to do. So, if you have any problems like that, check out The Story Doctor, Sundays at 8 p.m. Other than that, thank you for joining me on AutoCrit Live. I really appreciate all of you. And if you have any thoughts about this program or anything else, you can always email me, daniel@autocrit.com. Otherwise, I'll see you again sometime. Get back to writing, okay? Bye, everybody.